Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan. We're recording this episode just before Christmas, so myself and my co-host John Dorney would like to offer all our listeners a very Merry Christmas and a very happy and peaceful New Year. Please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you hear a podcast you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. The Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story is included in a link in the show notes. If you would consider supporting the show, please click on the link, and we're so grateful to all our patrons. Thank you. This episode of the show is a little different. 10 years ago, we made a podcast series for the Irish Genealogy company Timeline Research Limited. There were 5 episodes in the series, and I've put the 5 of them together here so you may notice that this episode of the show is a bit longer than usual. The episodes were about tracing your Irish ancestors and looking into different aspects of Irish genealogy. I was very pleased to be joined by Ireland's leading genealogist, Nicola Morris. Nicola Morris is the director and founder of Timeline. She sits on the board of the Irish Manuscripts Commission and the Genealogy and Heraldry Committee of the Board of the National Library of Ireland, and she is currently president of the Accredited Genealogists of Ireland. Nicola has appeared on many shows such as Who Do You Think You Are?, the Irish Genealogy Roadshow, the Grey House Revival and the Tenements. So disregard the email addresses given out in the podcasts. The best way to contact Nicola is at the email address research@timeline.ie.
Hello and welcome to a new series of podcasts by Timeline.ie, Ireland's leading professional genealogy and historical research company. During this series, we shall be looking at different aspects of Irish history and giving you helpful tips on how to trace your Irish ancestors. My name is Cathal Brennan, and in each episode I will be joined by professional genealogist Nicola Morris. 2014 is the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. On today's podcast, we're going to look at how you can track down your Irish ancestors' involvement in the Great War and how you could find out more on relatives who served at any stage in the British military. Hello Nicola, you're very welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Cathal.
Now first I think we're going to look at the reaction of people in Ireland to the outbreak of the First World War and what it would have motivated Irish people to enlist in the British forces.
Well, of course, there was a lot of different reasons why Irish men would have enlisted to serve during the First World War. They would be economic, as well as political and personal. So for some families, they would have had a military tradition. So there were Irish men serving in the British Army throughout its history. It made up a huge contingent of the British Army during the 19th century. So many young men would have had fathers and grandfathers who served in the British Army, and not just in officer class. There was also a huge propaganda machine that happened in Ireland at the outbreak of the war and during the first few months. So a response to the German atrocities that were committed in Catholic Belgium evoked a sympathetic response from Irishmen. Politically, at the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, the Irish Volunteers had already been established. They were established in November 1913, so they numbered about 180,000 in 1914. The Irish Volunteers were set up in response to the establishment of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and the two forces were determined to either bring Home Rule to Ireland or resist Home Rule if it was ever introduced into Ireland. So there was already a sort of a standing voluntary militia in place in the country by 1914. So at the outbreak of war, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond, called for Irishmen to enlist in the British Army, under the belief, I think, that by assisting Britain in her hour of need, it would help smooth the wheels towards the achievement of Home Rule for Ireland, which was incidentally already on the statute books, but it had been shelved until the end of the war. The majority of the Irish volunteers did eventually enlist, as well as the Ulster Volunteer Force obviously enlisting in the British Army as well. So there was a sense too that with Ulstermen and Irishmen fighting together would perhaps bring about some kind of unity that wasn't present in Ireland in 1914. One of the other reasons, and it was just a very practical one, and probably the reason that applied to the majority of people who did enlist, was that the British Army offered a regular wage. Although it was very low, it was still regular, and 2 meals a day. For young men who had no employment and no opportunities for employment, this was a chance for them to earn some kind of a wage. And also, if they lost their lives, provide a pension for wives that would be widowed. There was also a sense too of camaraderie. Young men joined up together. So you would be with brothers and neighbours and friends in the same regiments. And there were regiments that were called Pals Battalions because they were made up of people who joined from the same place, sometimes from the same place of work, sometimes from the same geographical area. So all of these were reasons why Irishmen joined the British Army at the start of the First World War.
Nicola, is it difficult to put an exact number on the amount of Irishmen who served during the First World War?
It is. And one of the reasons for this is because Irishmen didn't just join in Ireland. They didn't just join Irish regiments. Irishmen joined up in England and Scotland. They also would have joined up in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States. So there were men of Irish birth or men of Irish parentage who joined up different regiments all over the world to serve in the First World War. And this makes it very difficult to identify exactly how many men on this island would have joined up at the outbreak of the war.
And were there regiments in England and Scotland that would have been traditionally seen as Irish regiments, or were men from an Irish background or an Irish immigrant background would have joined up?
There would have been in places like Manchester and Liverpool and parts of Scotland as well, there were regiments that would have had very much an Irish flavour. And for example, English soldiers who, perhaps Catholic English soldiers, would have served in an Irish regiment because they would be with Catholic men at the same time. So you see a mixing of people of perhaps a different nationality in the same regiment, but they do have some kind of common ground that binds them together.
And conversely, if we see a soldier who's listed as serving with the Royal Irish Rifles or the Connacht Rangers, does it necessarily mean that he was Irish?
No, not necessarily. So largely they would be made up of Irish men, but again, there may be men from England and Scotland who would have joined those regiments as well. That's why it makes it very difficult to put a figure on how many Irish men served. Now, the consensus is that it was about 200,000 men, Irish men, that served during the First World War.
What are the best figures we can come up with for the amount of Irishmen serving in the British forces during the war?
According to David Fitzpatrick from Militarism in Ireland 1900 to 1922, a total of about 206,000 Irishmen served in the British forces during the war. Of these, 58,000 were already listed in the British Regular Army or Navy, some serving as regular soldiers and others as reservists. So another 130,000 men were volunteer recruits from Ireland during the duration of the war. 24,000 of these originated from the National Volunteers and 26,000 from the Ulster Volunteers, and 80,000 of these were new recruits who had no experience in either of the paramilitary formations. So of the wartime recruits, about 137,000 went to the British Army, 6,000 to the Royal Navy and 4,000 to the Royal Air Force.
Now, during the First World War, did conscription exist in Ireland?
No. Now, conscription was introduced in Britain in 1916. It wasn't introduced in Ireland. And when talk of introducing conscription into Ireland was brought up in the later years of the war, there was massive resistance to it. And we see, looking at newspaper reports from 1918, of the incidents of anti-conscription meetings that were happening and protests that were happening across the country.
And this wouldn't have solely been in nationalist areas, would it?
No, this would have been all over the country, including parts of Ulster. But we similarly see conscription being resisted in other Commonwealth countries like Australia and Canada as well. When it was put to the vote nationally, the idea of conscription was rejected by the populations there too.
So now, Nicola, if we have the name of a relative who we think served with the British Army in the First World War, We'll say our grandmother's uncle, for example. What's our next step?
The first thing that you need to do is find out as much as you can about that individual before you start looking for military service records for them. So you need to determine their date of birth and their place of birth. This will become important when it comes time to start looking at service records. You also need to determine what their full name was. So you may have known your great-granduncle as Jack Riley. Now, he's probably not on official records as Jack, he's more than likely recorded as John. It's also possible that he was born James John Riley. So you need to determine all the variants of the name that he might have gone under. Similarly, you need to look at how the surname Riley might be spelled. Now, you might spell it R-E-I-L-L-Y, but when it's written on a service record, it might be written as R-I-L-E-Y, and there's other variants that could be used. So you need to determine all of those before you get started. And this is just to make sure that when you're searching, you don't miss out on a particular record because you haven't considered a name that the person might be recorded under. It's also helpful, if you possibly can, to try and identify the regiment that they served in. One of the ways of doing this is to look for civil records that pertain to that individual during the period of the war. So did Jack Riley marry after 1914 and before 1920? His marriage certificate may give the details of the regiment he was serving with. Did he have any children during that period? So again, birth certificates for his children may state the name of the regiment that he was serving with. And lastly, do you have any photographs of him? So in uniform. So if you have photographs of an individual in uniform, or if you have any medals or insignia, they may be helpful in identifying what kind of regiment he served with.
Now, if we wanted to check his details using a national census, what national censuses are available for us to check? Which ones are online?
Well, there's only 2 complete surviving census returns for Ireland, and that would be 1901 and 1911. So it can be useful to look up somebody in the 1911 census, which is obviously only 3 years before the outbreak of the war, to see what information you can gather about them. It's also worthwhile trying to identify siblings of this individual who may not be known to you. It's possible that a series of brothers joined up together and may have even served in the same regiment. So it's worth identifying how many people are in the family and how many men of service age will be found in the family.
Now, I believe there is trouble finding some British Army records from this period. What is one of the problems with them?
Okay, so once you've identified your family member who you believe served in the First World War and found out as much as you can about them, the next step is to start looking at service records. The difficulty with First World War service records is that they were stored with the War Office. And during the Blitz in 1940, that office was bombed and a large portion of those records were destroyed. So they estimate about 60% of the service records were destroyed during that bombing. So unfortunately, there are a large portion of records for men who served in the First World War that you're not going to be able to find. The service records and pension records that do survive are divided into 2 categories. So one is called the burnt collection. And these were the service records that were rescued from that building. And the reason they're called the burnt collection, obviously, and it can be seen when you look at them, some of them are damaged by fire, others are damaged by water. So the burnt collection, which is WO363, that's the National Archives of Ireland reference number for them, were stored in the National Archives. They were microfilmed and they have now been digitised and they're available for research on ancestry.co.uk. The other collection are the pension records, and that's WO364 is their designation in the National Archives of Ireland. They're also known as the unburnt collection, and these were the collection that weren't damaged during the war. But they really only pertain to men who would have applied for a pension after the war and who were not in service after 1920. Any Irishmen who remained in service with the British Army after 1920, their service records are held separately by the Department of Defence, and you need to apply to the Department of Defence for a copy of their service record. But really the majority of you people would have been discharged or demobilised at the end of the war. Many of them would have applied for pension, but considering the political climate in Ireland at the time when they were discharged, some of them may not have applied for a pension. So really what we're left with is about between 30 and 40% of records of service and pensions for men who served in the First World War. That's English, Scottish, Irish men who served in the First World War. Do you have about a 1 in 3 chance of finding a record for an individual from this particular collection. But of course, there are other sources that you can use to find out more about your ancestor's service.
Well, could you tell us about some of those other sources?
Okay, well, the next most valuable source are the medal roll index cards. There was about 5 million men and women who received a medal for their service during the First World War. And this constitutes largely the entire service during that period of non-commissioned officers and women who served as nurses. So you have the British War Medal and the Victory Medal, which was awarded to everybody who served. There were also medals for people who served during particular periods in the war, specifically 1914 and 1915. There were also medals given for people who were wounded and discharged because of their wounds or sickness during the period of the war, and these were known as the Silver Star medals. So the card indexes for these awards are held in the British National Archives, and they have created an index of the 5 million names, which is available on their website. It's available to search for free. You can also access the card index medal rolls on ancestry.co.uk, but they only have about 4.8 million of the names in the database to date. Presumably that will be increased over time. The index card, if located, will record the name, the rank, the unit and regimental number, and the medal that they were entitled to, and a roll reference which can be used to consult the medal roll. The medal roll, if you're able to find a reference to it, will give you details of the specific battalion, brigade or battery in which the individual served. Often there'll be a reference to the theatre of war in which they served and when they entered that theatre. And this can be particularly valuable if you want to then go on and find out more about the action that they would have seen during that period. Occasionally you can find a date of death or a date of discharge and remarks on the career of the individual on their index card. So the cards only record the fact that the individual was entitled to a medal and doesn't record whether that medal was collected by that individual. So again, you may find many Irish men who were entitled to a medal and the card will record this, but they themselves, because of the political climate at home, may not have actually made an application to receive the medal themselves. When you look at the medal index cards, you'll see that the War Office would have used a series of abbreviations in describing what unit, what action that person saw. Using the National Archives website, where you can access the index to the medal cards, you will see they'll give you a list of all of the different abbreviations that are used, so it shouldn't be too difficult to translate what is meant by a series of numbers and letters that you'll see on the card itself.
So if we were to look now at regimental museums, first, what do you mean by an Irish regiment?
There were a number of regiments within the British Army that would have been known as Irish regiments. And as we've already said, that doesn't mean that they were made up exclusively of Irish men. Going to the Regimental Museum can actually give you a very interesting history about the formation and the development of those regiments. Over the course of the history of the British Army, we see regiments being merged, their names being changed, and being given different designations. So they have a very fluid history. But at the time of the outbreak of the First World War, some of the main Irish regiments that we would be familiar with would be the Connacht Rangers, the Munster Fusiliers, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Royal Inniskillings, and various others. Each regiment has its own regimental museum, and these can often be very, very worthwhile looking up their websites or contacting them directly, because they will have collected a lot of information about the individuals that were enlisted in those regiments.
Say, for example, somebody lived in Dublin. Where would they go to find out about the Royal Dublin Fusiliers?
The Royal Dublin Fusiliers, you'll be able to find information about them at the Gilbert Library on Pearse Street. The Connacht Rangers, for example, have a regimental museum in Roscommon, and they've done a lot of work on gathering information on the various men that served. There's also, if you're looking at Irish men who served in the First World War, it's worth starting to look at local sources, so Irish sources that will document them. And one of the most useful of these are newspapers. What you find is that local men who were sent home because of injury or who were on leave would be interviewed for the local paper. And they would account not just for themselves, but would also often mention other men, neighbours and friends from the same area that they were in the trenches with. And this can be a huge resource for establishing where somebody was at a particular time, what kind of action they might have seen, and who they were serving with. So if you don't find a service record for one individual, you may be able to track down service records for their comrades in arms.
Nicola, say we know we have a relative who died in France or Flanders during the war, but we're not sure where he's buried. What's our next step?
Okay. Well, there's a wonderful website which is called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they have documented the location of the graves and memorials for all of the men who died during the First and indeed the Second World War. It's free to use. All you need really is a surname. Now, obviously, you put in Riley, you're going to find an awful lot of memorials, but what that will turn up for you is the name of the individual, the regiment that they were serving with, their date of death, and the place where they're commemorated. So that's either where they are buried or where there is a memorial for them. The website is free to use, and I'm going to put a list of all the various websites that I've referred to with this podcast on our website timeline.ie so that you can follow through on them afterwards. Now, along with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, there's another source for identifying what happened to an Irishman that died during the First World War. So the Committee of the National War Memorial in 1923 published an 8-volume collection called Ireland's Memorial Records 1914 to 1918. And they endeavoured to identify all of the Irishmen who died during the First World War. Now, this collection does include Irishmen who joined English regiments and Irishmen even who were born in England. So it doesn't place a specific figure, or it's very difficult to identify a specific figure for how many Irishmen died during the First World War, or certainly Irishmen of Irish birth who died during the First World War. So this collection includes 49,400 names of individuals. It's available on the website irishorigins.com to research, where you can access the images of the book itself, which are beautifully illustrated by Harry Clarke. Now, these records include, as with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the name of the individual, their regimental number, the regiment they were serving with, their date of death, their place of death, although this is often just referred to as France, so it doesn't give you anything more specific than that, and then along with that, their place of birth. So it can identify somebody as having been born in a particular town or county in Ireland, which can help you to determine whether this is the person you're looking for or not. Sometimes, very occasionally, the age of the individual might be recorded. So when you've determined the regiment that they were serving in and the date of death for them, there's a very exciting next step that you can take, and this is to start looking at the unit diaries, which were created during the course of the war. The British National Archives have recently started digitising these unit diaries, and you can search them and download them for a small fee from their website. And these give an incredible amount of insight into the daily operations and actions undertaken by each unit during the course of the war. So I started by looking at the Ireland Memorial Records. I was looking for a Christopher Byrne. So when I searched this, I found that there was actually 4 men who died during the First World War who were named Christopher Byrne.
And how would you exclude the other Christopher Byrnes? How do you know you have the right guy?
Okay, for in a number of ways. First of all, the Ireland Memorial Records recorded places of birth for each of these individuals. Now, I knew that the Christopher Byrne I was looking for had been born in Donnybrook in Dublin City, and this is what it stated in the Ireland Memorial Records for him, that he was born in Donnybrook. So I was able to identify the correct one out of the 4 that I was looking at. So this Christopher Byrne, according to the Ireland Memorial Records, was a private in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars and was killed in action in France on the 31st of October 1914. So I was able to go to the National Archives website and look for the unit diary for the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. The diary was a daily diary, so I was able to go to the 31st of October 1914. So they were fighting at Hollabeck, and this is what the officer recorded. Shelling started in the morning, and German infantry were seen on the ridge. Counter-attack was ordered on the east side of the canal, but this never got very far. As the day went on, the shelling became steadily heavier. Machine guns were destroyed. Captain Hunt and Captain North were killed. All the damage was done in trenches provided with overhead cover. Narrow trenches without parapets were immune. After the heaviest possible shelling, a strong infantry attack developed, and we called in the French to strengthen trenches. At 9 p.m. we withdrew to Saint-Éloi. There was a heavy sniping there, so we had no billets. We went on to Vermellazé and bivouacked there. In the margin of the diary, beside this account, was a list of the 5 dead and 17 wounded that day, and the dead included Private Byrne. So this gives you a description of the action that was being taken at the time, the circumstances under which his death would have taken place. So it tells so much more of the story of that individual service. So the National Archives have only just started digitising this, and there are millions more pages to come. But because of the commemoration, the centenary of the First World War, I expect we're going to see the entire collection being digitised in the coming years.
It's a lot more satisfying than just reading a death date on an internet site.
Exactly, because it gives you the colour. I only looked at the 31st of October 1914, which was the day that he died. But as you go back through the diary, you can see the various actions that were being undertaken and a sense of what these men were facing day after day after day in the trenches. There's another really wonderful source. Now, it doesn't apply to everybody who served during the First World War, but these are the wills of Irish soldiers. So within their pay book, there was actually a form which allowed them to write their last bequest. Before they were sent over the top, out of the trenches, they were requested to do this. So the collection that pertains to Irish soldiers is stored in the Irish National Archives on Bishop Street. And this collection has been digitised by the National Archives. It was originally put together by genealogist Ciara Gregory, who transcribed all of the entries, and the National Archives have provided scanned images to go with this database. So you can search it for free on the National Archives website. It's a wonderful collection. It's heartbreaking in the simplicity of the bequests that were made, often by very young men who didn't have wives to leave anything to, but left all their worldly possessions, which couldn't have amounted to very much, to their mothers, to their sisters, or to their fathers. In some cases, they would have just stated all of their worldly possessions, but you do find others where they've given a list, sometimes just referring to a wallet and a Bible that they carried to ensure that those were returned to their parents or to another family member. But what's useful about these wills is that they will give the name and the address of the person that they've left their worldly goods to. So again, it gives you another clue to identifying the correct individual. If you find a soldier's will and he names his mother as Kathleen Byrne of this particular address, you should be able to confirm that you found the right family.
Do any records exist with religious groups, such as the Catholic Church or the Church of Ireland?
Well, certainly the Church of Ireland, you will find in churches around the country plaques and memorials to local men who fought and died in the First World War. But other interesting institutions actually memorialise men who died during the First World War. So Guinness's, for example, have a memorial for the men who enlisted and who were employees of Guinness's. You also see some of the railway companies, and you can see plaques that are still standing in railway stations. I think there's one in Connolly Station that commemorates the men who died during the First World War. So looking at institutions and some churches, you may find records that will identify local people or employees who fought and died during the First World War.
Nicola, we might just talk about the Bureau of Military History. Didn't some IRA men have previous experience in the British Army?
Yes, and it's very interesting when you look at the witness statements that are part of the Bureau of Military History. You find references to individuals who came to the volunteers in 1918, 1919 and used the training that they'd received in the British Army to start training the volunteers, the precursor to the IRA. So again, if you're having trouble finding information about an ancestor who served in the British Army, it can be worth looking at the Bureau of Military History witness statements to see if there's a reference to them on the other side of things after the war. So those records, the Bureau of Military History witness statements, were collected in the 1950s, and they are testimony given by men who fought in the War of Independence and the Civil War about their experiences from the 1916 Rising until 1921, and they're freely available online on the website of the Irish Military Archives.
And looking back through newspaper reports at the time, after the First World War, would there be much mention of ex-servicemen's organisations or the Royal British Legion?
No, and it's very difficult for families who perhaps had somebody who served in the First World War, because once the war was over and as we entered the conflict that then happened on this island, we find that families just did not talk about that service.
Have you come across evidence of Irishmen who served in more than one major war?
Well, yes, because a lot of Irishmen would have served in the Boer War. So from 1899 to 1902, they would have been serving in South Africa. And by the by, this is often a very useful clue as to why you may not find somebody in the 1901 census if you're looking for a young man during that period. Some of the reasons why they might be missing from the country at that time may be because of service in the British Army. So of course people who served then would have re-enlisted or have been in the reserves at the outbreak of the First World War and possibly would have gone back into service as well. And similarly, when you look at the Irish volunteers and people who undertook to drill the volunteers in 1913, they may have had military experience, possibly suggesting that they had served with the British Army during the Boer War. And there are service records, pension records for people who served in the Boer War, as well as medal rolls as well.
Well, thank you very much. That was Nicola Morris from timeline.ie. And if you are interested in tracing any family member's background who's involved in the British Army, you should contact the website timeline.ie.
Yeah, you can find details of this podcast on our website, as well as contact form. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. And we'll be doing further podcasts on different themes and different sources that might be useful for your research. So we'd really like to hear from you.
Hello and welcome to the second episode in a new series of podcasts by timeline.ie, Ireland's leading professional genealogy and historical research company. During this series, we will be looking at different aspects of Irish history and giving you helpful tips on how to trace your Irish ancestors. My name is Cathal Brennan, and in each episode I will be joined by professional genealogist Nicola Morris. On today's podcast, we will be going through a step-by-step process of tracing your Dublin ancestors and the different sources that you can use. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Cathal. How are you?
Now, I suppose one of the things that would have really interested people over the last year or so in tracing where their Dublin ancestors lived would have been the anniversary of the 1913 lockout, and especially the role that housing played in that. Now, you were involved in some TV shows dealing with the tenements and housing conditions in Dublin. What was that like?
Well, it was fascinating to be able to explore the lives that people were living in the tenements in Dublin City at that particular time. So from about the mid-19th century right through to the 1920s, we looked at what conditions people were living in the tenements. About a third of the population of Dublin City were living in one-room tenements. What kind of houses were converted into and what the conditions would have been like. So getting water into the top story of a tenement building, so it had to be carried up from the ground floor. Access to sanitation, so you had buildings where there was one privy that served maybe 70 people. And through that then looking at who the people were that owned these buildings, who created the tenements, the population that were living in. It's very important to perhaps understand those conditions when you want to look at your family history, particularly families who originated in Dublin City, because tenement living would have had a big impact on how they lived their lives, who survived, and then what kind of records are available that enable us to identify those families.
And I suppose people living in tenements, it would have been very transitory. You wouldn't have really stayed in the same tenement for many, many years, would you?
No, and that's one of the biggest problems that people face when they're looking at their family in Dublin City or trying to research their family in Dublin City, because they tended to move around quite a lot. People might only be in one tenement for maybe 6 months. Some of the reasons for this would have been perhaps staying one step ahead of the debt collectors, not being able to pay your rent. So people would pay a deposit on a tenement, they would be able to stay there for a couple of months, they'd accrue an arrear, and then they'd leave and move somewhere else. Now, that wasn't the case for everybody. As families grew, they needed to move to perhaps a building or a room that would accommodate a larger family, and indeed as families diminished, you might move to find somewhere that was a little bit smaller and easier to accommodate yourself. People also moved in search of work. So there may have been work available on the north side of the city, and it was better to move up there rather than having to travel across the city for work. So there was lots of different reasons why people moved around, but it makes it very difficult to trace them. So when you're searching a family in a rural area, the focus tends to be on tracing a family at a particular location, at a townland address. Whereas in Dublin City, because they moved around a great deal, it can be a lot more difficult to follow them back from one generation to the next.
Now, if people wanted a starting point, they know maybe where their grandparents lived in the 20s or the 30s. Where do they go from there?
Well, I think the best thing to do when you're getting started is to actually talk to as many family members as possible and try and gather as much information as you can. This is important because there may just be a little clue that Great Aunt Mary once said that will prove to be really vital in your research. So, for example, at the moment I've been researching a family in Dublin City, and we know that they married in the 1930s and they had 6 children. So we've managed to find 4 of their children, but I can't find a marriage certificate for them anywhere. So I went back to the client to just explain I'd hit this brick wall. I hadn't found evidence of them in Dublin. I'd searched the entire country for a record of their marriage and still hadn't found a record of it. So the client got back to me and was able to say, oh, well, in talking to other family members, the story came out that the head of the family had actually been in Canada and served in the Canadian Mounted Police. Well, it's quite possible that he actually met and married his wife in Canada before returning to Ireland where they had their family. So that little clue, if we hadn't known about it, has now led us to looking at Canadian records for evidence of this family and perhaps a marriage record there which will give us their parents' names. So every little piece of or scrap of information may prove valuable to your research as it progresses. So gather as much as you can from family members. It's also important to perhaps not necessarily focus on your direct ancestor. So you might be looking for your grandfather or your great-grandfather. If he's got a very common name, he's John or he's Patrick, he might be difficult to find. Whereas if you know or you're able to establish from other family members that he perhaps had a brother called Christopher, a sister called Cecilia, it might be easier to locate records for them because they have a slightly more unusual name. And those records will still tell you about your grandfather's parents, but you're just taking a little bit more of a roundabout route. So there's an example I had a couple of years ago. I was looking for a family again in Dublin City. Their surname was Byrne, which was an incredibly common name in the city. And all I knew that there was 3 brothers, Michael, Patrick and Daniel, that they were born between 1911 and 1920. And we didn't know anything else about them. And we knew what age order they came in. It was Michael, Patrick and Daniel. So I went to the civil birth register. There was hundreds of Michaels, there was hundreds of Patricks, there was hundreds of Daniels. But because the civil birth register records the mother's maiden name in the index, and I made a record of all the mother's maiden names for each of those children, I was able to identify 3 children who shared the same mother's maiden name, thus identifying the 3 brothers. And that was able to, rather than buying 400 birth certificates, I was able to narrow it down to those 3. But without the names of the brothers, I wouldn't have been able to find the family. So ancillary information about other members of the family can sometimes be the key that unlocks your search.
It seems to be like great detective stories, looking for almost a needle in a haystack sometimes.
It is, and Dublin City can be and can feel a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. And that's why you've got to employ these kind of little tricks, taking a roundabout route. And that's what makes it fun as well, because when you finally find the records that you're looking for, it's very, very satisfying.
Now, how much do church records play a part in your searches?
Really, what you want to do is actually start with civil records. So we have civil registration in Ireland, which started in 1864 for births, deaths and marriages. And it was compulsory from that date. At the same time, obviously, you have churches recording baptisms and marriages, and to a far lesser extent, burials. Access to church records can be quite difficult. Now, there are some Dublin City parishes that are very amenable and will answer questions and will look up records for you. They're under no obligation to let you go in and look at the registers yourself. So when you're looking for somebody perhaps in the 1910s, 20s and 30s, access to those records can be quite difficult. Whereas civil registration, the indexes for those records are freely available. They're available online for free at a website called familysearch.org. You can also visit the General Register Office in Dublin, which is on Werburgh Street, where they have a research room, and you can sit down and work through the index books yourself. Once you find the record that you're looking for in the index book, you can order a copy of it at the counter, or you can indeed order copies online at our website, timeline.ie. Civil birth certificates and marriage certificates are very informative, and in some cases more so than church records. And as I said, they're more accessible. There's a much more methodical way of accessing them. A marriage certificate, for example, a civil marriage certificate will record the name of the bride and groom, their ages, their occupations, their address at the time of marriage, the name of their father and their father's occupation. It'll also identify the church in which they got married and the names of the witnesses. So that one document alone is going to give you a lot of information about 2 generations of your family. So I would always recommend that you start with the birth certificate for your grandparent, say, or even your parent. That will tell you both parents' names, their mother's maiden name, their address at the time of birth, and the father's occupation. Once you've got both parents' names, then you can search for a marriage certificate for those 2 parties. You need to know the mother's maiden name, usually to identify the correct marriage certificate. Marriage certificate will give you the father's name of the bride and groom, and then you can start searching for the birth certificates for your great-grandparents, and methodically working back through each generation. Birth, marriage, birth, marriage, birth, marriage should very quickly help you to build up quite a detailed family tree. You're going to find difficulties when you're dealing with common surnames, but as I said, you've got to employ little tricks to see if you can get around that. It's also important to note that the Civil Birth Index from 1903 records the mother's maiden name and the date of birth in the index. So if you are lucky enough to be able to get into Dublin and check those indexes yourself, because that information is not available online, you can quite easily identify the correct birth record for an ancestor who has a common name, because you know they were born, say, on the 17th of October. Now, do be careful about dates of birth. Now, a lot of people have come to me and said, no, he was born in 1920. And when we've gone to the records, we've discovered he was actually born in 1919 or 1921. So there can be a little, even in the 20th century, they can be a little bit vague about the exact year of birth for a person.
Another source I'd like you to talk about is census records, the 1901 and 1911 census. How have they played a part in your research?
Well, they're absolutely vital. And so your first objective should be to try and reach your family or find your family in the census. Now, don't just go rushing straight in and try and pick up anybody who's got the right name and perhaps the right age. You want to try and verify that you found the right family. So again, using birth and marriage certificates, get a birth certificate for somebody who's born as close as possible to the 1911 census. That'll give you a family address, both parents' names and the occupation. So then when you're looking at the census return, you're saying, right, well, here's Mary Byrne. We know her father was Joseph and her mother was Celia, and this is the right census return. Her father was a carpenter or a tanner, or maybe a brewery worker, and they're living in Mountjoy Square, which is the same address on her birth certificate in 1909. So you want to make sure that you verify that you found the correct family in the census. The census is freely available online at the website of the National Archives of Ireland, so you can search it as much as you want at no cost. But there is a little trick that you can use if you're having difficulty, again, dealing with a family in Dublin City who has a very common name. Because you can only search the census on the National Archives website for one particular person. And that can be very difficult. Again, you're looking for a Mary Byrne. You might find, there's 20 Mary Byrnes who are between 1 and 3 years old. You can go to ancestry.co.uk. They also have the Irish census online. But their search function allows you to search for more than one person in the household. So you can, again, search for a Mary Byrne, Father Joseph, Mother Celia, and that'll maybe more quickly identify the right record for you. Now, Ancestry have 14-day free trials on their website. So if you haven't used one already, it might be worth your while signing up for that. Just make sure you remember to sign off again or to cancel your subscription before the 14 days are up. But you can get an awful lot of work done on their collection as well.
Say, for example, you knew that your father or grandfather was born in a corporation house or a corporation flat in the 1930s. Would the corporation keep records? I'm just curious, I don't know if they do. Would the corporation keep records that would be available to the public where they would have interviewed the family before they gave them the house and you could find out all this information about your relatives?
Well, you see, a lot of that is going to be personal information, and that information is protected and is not usually released until 100 years have passed. So anything from the 20s and the 30s really isn't going to be in the public domain. What there is, however, again for Dublin City, are the electoral rolls. So from 1939 right up to 1964, there are electoral rolls for Dublin City. So anybody who is registered to vote are going to be recorded in that. And that can be a very useful way of identifying addresses for your family. So you can search them, you can search a certain amount of them online, at, I think it's the website of the Dublin City Libraries. But if you do go into the Dublin City Library and Archive on Pearse Street, they have access to the entire roll from 1939. Now there is another set of electoral rolls which date, I think, from 1908, which are for the corporation elections, which are now being made available in the Dublin City Library and Archive as well. And what's interesting about these is these record female voters. So you do get the female population. At a time, obviously, when the suffrage movement was happening, you get female registered voters as well, which can be a very interesting look for female members of your family as well.
If you were asked to look back at the family history of people who were Church of Ireland or Presbyterian or Jewish or some other minority faith, is that a lot easier, or are the records more detailed because there's a smaller population?
Again, those groups would also appear in civil registration. So from 1864, everybody would have appeared in civil registration because it was compulsory. But otherwise then there are separate sets of records for the different denominations that would have been in Dublin City. So there's excellent collections for the Jewish population in Dublin City, for example. And there is a multiple volume collection of material created by Stuart Rosenblatt, which is available in the National Archives of Ireland, which is essentially attempting to document every Jewish family that has been residing in Ireland, and because there was such a large population in Dublin City, documenting those Dublin City families. They have records from, I think it's a midwife, who would have overseen births of Jewish children over a very long period of time from the 19th and into the 20th century. So her records are available as part of that collection. Rosenblatt has also identified all the Jewish families in the census returns, for example. So there's an absolute wealth of information on Jewish families in his material. Church of Ireland, there are Church of Ireland parish registers. Now, for Dublin and for the rest of the country, the Church of Ireland records were deposited in the Public Records Office, which was what was destroyed in 1922 by fire. So there is a portion of Church of Ireland parish registers that have been destroyed. What survives for Dublin City has at this point largely been indexed and is available online at the website irishgenealogy.ie. Again, it's a free website set up by the Irish State with access to Church of Ireland and Roman Catholic registers for Dublin City. Again, this can be very useful in your research, identifying family members, identifying siblings. Church records can often record addresses on them, occupations, particularly on Church of Ireland records. Anything that's not available online, Church of Ireland registers for Dublin City are either available in the National Archives of Ireland or in the representative church body library in Braemore Park in Churchtown. So it may be necessary for you to again visit those repositories to manually search the registers yourself. There's another just a little point that civil registration of marriages in Ireland commenced in 1864, but from 1845 non-Catholic marriages had been registered. So if you are looking at a Church of Ireland family, it's well worth checking the civil registration of marriages right the way back to 1845, because again, marriage certificate will record the father's name and the father's occupation of the bride and groom. So that can be incredibly useful. The Presbyterian Historical Society, which is located in Belfast, are a very good resource for identifying Presbyterian records. A lot of those churches are now closed, so it can be a little bit of detective work trying to track down where the registers for those particular records are currently held and how you can gain access to them. So again, the same would be true of Methodist and Unitarian congregations in Dublin City.
For the amateur historian, how daunting is it to go back into the 19th and 18th century when you're tracing back your family tree?
It can seem very daunting at the start, but I think the trick is to be really methodical. Tackle each generation as it comes. And don't try and rush right back to the earliest ones. Gather as much as you can on each generation as you see them. So I'd see if you can identify all of the siblings of each family. Again, the marriage records, the birth records. Find them in the 1901 and the 1911 census. And remember, there may be more than one or two generations of your family living at the time of the census. So just because you found your grandfather and his parents in the census doesn't mean that your great-great-grandparents aren't also alive and in time at the census. So try and search for them as well. Census returns are so valuable, particularly 1901 and 1911, because they'll also tell you somebody's occupation, where they were born. And remember, a lot of people would have come into Dublin City from other parts of the country throughout the 19th century. So you may find families from Carlow, Kildare, Meath, Wicklow, and from further afield who've settled in Dublin City. And one of the tricks I've used when looking at 19th century families is, if I identify a family of a particular name and discover in their census return that they said they've come from Carlow, well, I'll search the 1901 census for anybody else with the same surname who also gives a place of birth as Carlow, because you may then be identifying several siblings who all originated from the same place in Carlow. And it's the records perhaps of one of the siblings that might tell you more about where they came from in Carlow, who their parents were, what their parents' occupations were, and not necessarily, again, your direct ancestor. The census returns are really important. Gathering as much as you can on each generation and documenting it. Make a record. Every time you find something, write it down, copy it into your family tree software. Just make sure that you keep a collection of it. I have met people who have found records, and when they've come back later on going, oh, I know that was there, I found it in the census, and whatever little quirk they used when they searched it the first time, they found it impossible to find that record again. We know it's there, it's going to take you a lot more time to find it maybe take you a lot more time to find it a second time round. There's other tricks for Dublin City. Although it can be very difficult and daunting, the population of Dublin City are actually probably much better documented than most of the population for the rest of the country, barring perhaps the other urban areas like Cork and Belfast, and to a lesser extent Limerick and Galway. So for Dublin City, you've also got prison registers. These are available online at findmypast.ie. It's well worth taking a look. You never know. You might not want to find out. But you see, people were picked up for an awful lot of very insignificant petty crimes. So a lot of people, families who would have been perhaps street traders, may have been picked up. You find abandoned children being collected up and appearing within the court systems as well. The workhouse. There are comprehensive registers for both the North and South Dublin Union workhouses for Dublin City that go right back to the 1840s, which we're very, very lucky to have. Attending the workhouse or having to seek relief in the workhouse was a very common occurrence for many, many families. And it wasn't necessarily to do with a lack of income. People used the workhouses for medical care as well. So you find a lot of children are born in the workhouse, and a huge number of people in Dublin City would have been suffering from TB. So they may have sought periodic medical care within the workhouse system. So the workhouse registers again are valuable because if you locate somebody in them, they record the name of the individual, their age, their address, their next of kin, perhaps the occupation of their next of kin. So this can often be the husband or wife of the person admitted, a son or daughter or a parent, and the period of time they're in the workhouse. So those records are very valuable. Now, if you have difficulty finding a member of your family in the 1901 or 1911 census, bear in mind the possibility that they could be in the workhouse or they could be in prison or some kind of institution. Now, in the census, somebody in an institution was usually only recorded by their initials. So try searching for that person under their initials. And you can also refine your search by using their initials, their religion, their approximate age, and that can help you to narrow down possibilities of your ancestor. You can then follow that up by looking at prison registers and workhouse registers to confirm whether it's the right person or not.
And what role would newspapers as a source play in your research in somebody's family tree? Newspapers
are becoming more and more valuable, and that's because more and more newspapers are now being digitized, so it's easier to search them. Somebody said to you they're looking for, and it's happened, people have come to me and said, oh, I have an ancestor and we think he emigrated because he was involved in a murder sometime in the 1870s. How would we find something out about that? Well, there's probably a newspaper report on it, but if you don't know exactly when that event happened, a manual search of newspapers is going to be very time consuming and really not very productive. Because of digitized newspapers, you can now just put a word into a search engine and see what turns up. Now, newspapers are actually pretty valuable for family history from the early 20th century, when most or more of the population started to have birth, death and marriage announcements recorded or published in the press. So rather than perhaps looking for a birth announcement for your ancestor, you might be better off looking for a death notice for them, because a death notice, which much later in their life and within perhaps the 20th century, may state the names of married children, may indicate where that person was born, or may indicate where that person was buried, which will then leave you to a grave record, records at Glasnevin Cemetery or Mount Jerome, which can be very, very detailed. In the 19th century, newspapers are perhaps less useful from about the 1830s to the 1900s because the general population of Dublin City weren't really having birth, death and marriage announcements being published. As you go back earlier, however, from the 1830s earlier, you find a lot more people publishing those kinds of announcements. And not just birth, death and marriage announcements. The newspapers prior to the 1830s were actually used to convey information to the general public, and some of which is of a very personal nature. So while you might find business advertisements in newspapers for that period, somebody opening a new business, an apprentice who has completed his apprenticeship and is going into business for himself, bankruptcies, things like that. You can also find notices about elopements or sort of husbands who are refused to take credit or refused to give credit for their wives because their wives have taken up with somebody else. So you get all this sort of personal or this dirty laundry being published in the newspapers so that people are informed as to what has been going on. And it can be very, very interesting if you're lucky enough to find something that pertains to your family.
Now, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the podcast, but it's just so much information there. I think we might continue on the discussion about tracing your Dublin relatives in episode 3. Thank you very much, Nicola. If anyone would like to contact Nicola, they can contact her through the website timeline.ie.
Thanks very much, Carl. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have any inquiries or queries, family mysteries that you'd like us to take a look at as part of our podcast series, don't hesitate to get in touch with us.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Timeline.ie podcast on Irish genealogy. Timeline.ie is Ireland's leading professional genealogy and historical research company. During this series, we will be looking at different aspects of Irish history and giving you helpful hints in tracing your Irish ancestors. My name is Cathal Brennan, and in each episode I will be joined by professional genealogist Nicola Morris. In the previous episode, we went through a step-by-step guide to tracing your Dublin ancestors. There were so many areas we didn't get to cover in the previous podcast, we've decided to continue on the discussion into this episode.
So one thing that might lead people down a bit of a blind alley is if they see children listed with the same name. Say if a child died and then the next child was given the same name. How often does this happen?
It's actually very common. The infant mortality rate was very, very high, so it's not unusual to find children dying in infancy and then the same name being given to another child later on. And this can be quite confusing because you might be looking for an ancestor of a particular name who you thought was born in 1875, but you've actually come across a birth record from 1868. It's probable that the earlier child maybe died and you're still looking for your own ancestor's birth record. Either the birth wasn't registered or the baptismal record hasn't been indexed and made available online or just hasn't survived. And that brings me to a point in terms of, again, civil registration. Although it was compulsory, lots of families didn't register births. For various reasons, you had to pay a fee to register a birth, so that may have been beyond the means of the family at the time. You were also fined if you didn't register a birth within the first 3 months of the child being born. So for many families who missed that window, they may just have not registered the birth at all. What you also can find is that they may have registered the birth 6 months later and changed the date of birth of the child so that it falls within the 3-month period. So I've found children who've been baptised in March and their birth certificate says they were born in October, which doesn't make any sense, but that would be one of the reasons why they did it. And so in Dublin City, you do find a lot of births going unregistered. What you also find is that children who were maybe born in hospital or in an institution, their birth would be registered by the administrator for that institution or that hospital. And oftentimes the child wasn't given a first name. So the child is going to be registered as unnamed female or unnamed male. Now, if you're having trouble finding your ancestor, particularly if you're using the online birth indexes, which don't make that quite clear, it may be the case that the child is registered but without a first name in the index. You might want to look at the unnamed children for a particular period of time.
When you're talking to amateur genealogists who are looking specifically at their own family history, What do they tell you that they find interesting about the process?
There's so many different things for different people. A lot of people discover how exciting it can be to just find that one birth certificate. And when talking about it when you haven't done it, I think people's eyes glaze over and go, how could you be so excited about just finding that one little record? But the needle in the haystack, when you do find it, it can be incredibly satisfying. The history of your family, particularly in Dublin City, then opens the doors to so much of the history of the city. A lot of people connect with families who were living in the tenements. The census might tell them that they had a great-great-grandmother who on the 1911 census recorded that she had 13 children, only 2 of whom were alive in 1911. So again, that just tells a story of great hardship for that particular woman and for many, many families in dealing with the loss of so many children in her lifetime. You meet people who have worked very, very hard, generation after generation, to perhaps bring us to a better place in our lives today. And it's very satisfying to see that we're perhaps doing a lot better because of the work that they did, that they put in to keep their children alive and fed and warm and clothed and educated so that they could survive and go on to have children themselves. You meet then the stories like the 1916 Rising, the lockout, the tenements, the visit of Queen Victoria to Dublin City, things like that. And then as you go back into the 19th century, again, you start stumbling across various little pieces of history. So I was recently talking to a woman who came across a collection of newspaper articles that named her ancestor, who was a woman widowed with a young child in the 1850s, living in a tenement in Dublin City. And she was caught in a conflict between the Church of Ireland and the Catholic Church. And it seems that the Irish Church Mission Society, who were really the Church of Ireland organisation who were pushing to convert Catholics to the Church of Ireland in return for education and relief, such as food and clothing and things like that. Now, they were actually sort of a small group within the Church of Ireland. It wasn't a policy of the Church of Ireland as a whole, but they were very, very strongly committed to this policy. They were operating in Dublin City and also in Galway. They raised huge funds in the 1850s from subscriptions and were able to sort of provide a huge amount of support to families in Dublin City. They were responsible for a lot of the orphanages that were opened that took in destitute children. The Catholic Church obviously saw this organisation as a huge threat because of their focus on conversion. And this woman discovered her ancestor at the centre of an argument. The woman was dying, she had a young daughter, and she had 2 great institutions vying for control over what happened to that child at the end of that woman's life. And that made it into the newspapers. So for this person doing the research herself, it was so exciting to discover what was going on at that particular time, something she had no idea about.
I suppose as well, there may be instances where going back through your family tree, you might find an immigrant having come into Ireland and you would not have known there was a, say, French or British line there.
Surprisingly, there were lots of Italians. People have found lots of Italian ancestors in Dublin City. Dublin in the early 19th century, there was a building boom going on. And this brought in a lot of very skilled craftsmen from all over Europe. So statue makers, people working with marble, wood turners, all sorts of things. So statue makers, people working with marble, wood turners, were coming into Dublin City because there was work, there was money to be spent on these great houses that were being built. They came, they settled, they either established themselves in that trade and went on for generations, or some didn't, weren't successful in their trade, but remained in Dublin City. So when you come across slightly unusual names, they may have a European origin, indicating that you have, yes, immigrant ancestors. When you do come across those unusual names and you start searching for them in databases, be aware that the parish priest who filled in the baptismal register or the clerk who filled in the birth certificate is probably going to impose a very unusual spelling on those names. There's no standardised spelling of them. So when you're searching for them, what I'll often do is, rather than search for the spelling that I've come across, extract the vowels, replace them with the asterisks, and just try to get the general gist of what the name is. And that should actually pick up a lot more people with the same surname that you might otherwise have missed. I mean, there was a huge amount of traffic between Ireland and England. So even if you're looking at families, say, on the North Docks, they would have been very strongly connected with Liverpool. And you'll often find brothers and sisters who then went and settled in Liverpool, who travelled backwards and forwards. It wouldn't have been considered a due hardship to make that kind of journey. So bear that in mind. If you're missing information on a family in Dublin City, perhaps have a look and see, are they showing up in English records? Again, many of which are easily available online. findmypast.co.uk has the civil birth registers for England, the census returns, as does Ancestry. And then historically, we have the Huguenots and other immigrant groups who would have come into Ireland, and some of which would have settled in Dublin City. So the Liberties owes a huge debt to the Huguenots, who would have established the textile industry in that part of the city, hundreds of years ago. So when you come across slightly unusual names, it's worth doing a little bit more digging to see perhaps where that name originated and how it has evolved and changed through unusual spellings over decades and centuries.
Well, relating to that, are there records available or easily available for cemeteries such as the Huguenot Cemetery or the various Jewish cemeteries around Dublin?
There's a number of different collections dealing with cemetery records. So I've already referred to the fact that Glasnevin, which is online, has the largest collection. It was the municipal cemetery for Dublin City. Their records date back to the 1830s, and really that's your first place to go and have a look. Mount Jerome was the Church of Ireland cemetery, but you will still find Catholic burials there as well. So those would be the two main ones for Dublin City. There is a publication which is a 10-volume collection called Memorials of the Dead for Dublin City and County. And so again, this is a listing of a lot of the smaller graveyards that would have existed within the city, and again, records of all the different burials that were there. Interestingly, prior to sort of civil registration, I suppose, the Church of Ireland, or prior to its disestablishment, the Church of Ireland acted as very much as a civil authority for Dublin City, and took the responsibility of burying not just members of the Church of Ireland, but members of other denominations as well. So you will often find Catholics being buried and their burials appearing in Church of Ireland burial registers in the early 19th and in the 18th century. So don't be surprised and don't assume that it means they were originally Protestant if you do find a Catholic family in Church of Ireland burial records. Unfortunately, a lot of the city cemeteries have disappeared and have been paved over, and the headstones that would have been in place there, have been lost, and the information on them has been lost. So we're relying on whatever registers that were kept rather than the actual standing stones themselves.
Would housing associations such as the Ivy Trust, for example, would they have kept records, and are those records available to the public?
Well, what you'd have to do is identify what the institution was. So is it Dublin Corporation in the 19th century? The Ivy Trust obviously would have been through the Guinness family and other charities and benevolent associations that were established, and then determine whether they have archives that document the families that they gave houses to. So the Guinness archive obviously is in St James's Gate. They have an archivist in place, so they would be available to answer any questions about that. Similarly, Dublin Corporation is quite interesting. To start with, even just looking at the minutes of Dublin Corporation for the 19th century, they've all been published and they're indexed and they're available in the Dublin City Library and Archive. So you can gather quite a lot of information about at least their approach to providing housing in the city throughout the 19th century. And they would have worked with the other sort of benevolent societies. So that could be a starting point for identifying who was building houses, and then seeing if you can track down individual records for those particular organisations, whether they have anything that documents housing that was provided at the time.
Now, when people hear occupational records, what does that mean, and how detailed would they be?
People living in rural areas are dealing in many cases with people who are farmers and agricultural labourers. And that's not to say that a lot of the population of Dublin City were also working as casual labourers. But we did still have various institutions where people were employed that can have really interesting employment records or occupational records. So, for example, Jacob's Biscuit Factory. Again, you see people on the census, particularly women who would have been biscuit packers. They would most likely have been working at Jacobs. The National Archives holds employment records for the Jacobs factory. These are absolutely incredible, actually. They have card indexes for each employee, and the index card will record the date of birth of that person, the name of their next of kin, their address, when they might have left their employment, and whether for females that was due to marriage. So the card index alone will give you a lot of information, and then you can go in and look at things like the wage books, which will tell you week to week how much the person was paid, what department of the factory they were working in. And it's really interesting to see as well how much of their pay went into special funds. So they'd have things like the holiday fund, the hospital fund, which money went into each week, which they could then draw down on when it was necessary. So Jacobs would be one, Guinness's would be another institution where you see, and they have great employment records. You can search their employment records on their website. Now, you won't get the whole record, and as a family member, you can then apply to Guinness's for a copy of the entire record. Again, these records will give you things like date of birth, address, other family members, details of a marriage, and so on. So the railways, large employer for Dublin City. The Irish Railway Records Society is based in Euston Station, and they meet every Tuesday evening from 5 o'clock. Is the only way to get in there and find out about their records. But they again have employment records for people working on the railways. And that's quite important when you look at people who perhaps came from other parts of the country into Dublin, that they may have originally been employed or been working on the railways, which brought them into the city, where they settled, had a family, and established themselves on for several generations. So looking at the railway can be quite interesting, and a lot of the canal companies were also tied into the railway companies as well. So there are various areas where you can look at occupational records. Another area which is useful are people who would have had businesses in the city. And it's well worth your while, if you get the chance, to take a look at some of the street and trade directories for Dublin City in the 19th century. And to start with, just have a look at how many trades were going on at that time. So you had individual shops, you had glove makers, umbrella makers, drapers, woolen merchants, wine merchants, jewellers, gunsmiths, whitesmiths, coffin makers, a wealth of different trades and professions and occupations being listed. So just getting an idea of what would have been going on in the city at the time, what kind of trades were being carried out. And then when you get those birth and marriage certificates and they say that your great-great-grandfather's father was a jeweller, well, then you want to see, did he have a shop? Is he listed in the trade directories? And the trade directories, the best one being Tom's Dublin directory, date from 1845 right up to the present day. You can follow people at a particular address, and you can follow somebody carrying out a particular trade. There are earlier directories like Pigot's, which date from the 1820s, and some which will take you right back into the late 18th century, although they obviously record less and less of the general population and focus on sort of the professions and the gentry of the city. But the trade directories will also pick up people who are barristers, doctors, the clergy. So there's a lot of useful information in those directories, particularly again for families in Dublin City. There's a great set available in the Dublin City Library and Archive on the open shelves, so you can sort of sit down, dip in and out from year to year very easily on those. And I think the majority of Tom's directory have now been digitised and are available on Find My Past and Irish Origins websites. Again, because they're digitised, you can just stick in a name and see what turns up. And that's a great way of finding somebody who might be listed in another part of the directory, perhaps somebody who is sitting on various charitable committees, as well as just being listed in the trade directory itself. There's quite a lot. If you can get a handle on somebody's occupation in the 19th century, there may be records that you can follow up on, which will tell you more about them and perhaps lead you to an earlier generation. Because don't forget, trades were often passed from father to son.
Now, just to return to the street directories there, as you mentioned, if you were looking back into a family member and you've seen a street listed, ABC Street in Fairview, and that street does not exist when you do a search. So when you look for ABC Street, do these Tom's directories, do they have maps as well, or just street listings?
They're just street listings, but then within the street listings or within the directory, you find a listing for a street. It will also give the neighbouring street or the larger street from which that street comes off. And then the parish that street is within. So it is quite possible to find a street listed in the directory and identify perhaps a street that has since changed its name. Another very useful source is there's an 1847 Dublin City map, which is incredibly detailed, again giving you all of the streets in existence at that time. It has been published online at the website Irish Origins, and you can use that, you can overlay that essentially with a present day map to identify streets whose names have changed, and as well to see when a street might have been built. So don't forget, the city is constantly being developed. So you discover in Tom's directory the street isn't there in 1862. In 1863, the street is there with only 3 houses on it. And then by 1875, you've got the street there with 18 houses on it. So you're seeing the development of those streets at a time. And it helps you match up addresses that you might find then on civil birth certificates and marriage certificates and even in parish registers. You know a family couldn't have been living at that address if the street didn't exist before the 1860s. There's another great source which sort of goes hand in hand with the 1847 town plan, which is the 1851 Dublin City census. Now, the majority of census returns for Ireland in the 19th century have been destroyed. But before the Dublin City census was destroyed, a record was made naming the heads of every household within the city from the 1851 census. Now, it doesn't tell us any more about the other occupants of the household, but at least it identifies each individual household and the name of the head of the household. So that's very well worth searching as you bring your family back to the 1850s. But do remember, the only person who's going to be recorded in it is an adult, usually the male, the head of the household. But it will at least tell you, again, where that family, what street that family and house number that family were living at that particular time.
So if we looked at sports and social clubs as a resource, do they make their records available? I'm thinking of more affluent social clubs like the gentlemen's clubs of the early 20th, 19th century, the golf clubs when it would have been a much more exclusive sport. Would they have records tracing back that far if you contacted them?
Possibly. And I think it would just be a matter then of identifying those clubs, institutions, organisations. A lot of sports clubs that do exist and that are still operating, that date back into the 19th century, may have records themselves. A lot of them will have a historian or an archivist working with them in an amateur or in a professional capacity to preserve those records. So what has survived, they should be able to make available to you. But you are still probably dealing with a very small proportion of the population of the city. Those wouldn't necessarily be pursuits that the general population would have been able to pursue. But also looking at things like newspapers and again some of the directories, that some societies would have published minutes of their meetings, the names of the president, the Hon secretary and things like that. So it might be worth taking a look at newspapers to see if you can identify an ancestor who may have been a member of one of those clubs and perhaps played an active role in its administration. But it is worth running down that organisation or that society or that club, if they still exist, to see whether there are any surviving records. If they no longer exist, it's worth trying either the Dublin City Library and Archive or the National Archives of Ireland would be the natural repositories for records from such organisations or societies. And then after that, perhaps the National Library of Ireland, who also receive a lot of manuscript collections, which they've preserved and catalogued and held on to.
Now, I think we've thoroughly covered tracing your Dublin relatives at this stage. Thank you very much, Nicola. If anyone would like to contact Nicola Morris, they can contact her through the website timeline.ie.
Thanks very much, Carl. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have any inquiries or queries, family mysteries that you'd like us to take a look at as part of our podcast series, don't hesitate to get in touch with us.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Timeline.ie podcast on Irish genealogy. Timeline.ie is Ireland's leading professional genealogy and historical research company. My name is Cathal Brennan, and on each episode I will be joined by professional genealogist Nicola Morris. In our earlier podcast, we've asked you to send in any questions you had, and we've had a great response, and we really appreciate the feedback from you, the listener. James M. Lernan has contacted the show and has posed some interesting queries for Nicola, which we'll deal with in this episode. Hi Nicola, welcome back.
Thanks, Cathal.
Now, one of the first issues that James raised is about the degree to which people would move around, families move around Ireland in the 19th century prior to the famine.
There's something wonderful about what genealogical research does, is that it takes generalisations that we assume about the general population and sort of breaks them apart, because every family that you look at, you tend to find sort of exceptions to these general rules or general conceptions that we have about the population. And one of them is to do with the movement of people around the country. So throughout the 19th century, while we would assume the majority of the population were fairly static, that people were born and died in the same place generation after generation, there was in fact numerous reasons why people would have moved around, including the pre-famine period. So although the famine was a catalyst for a massive movement of people, before that there were reasons that people moved around, one of them being other famines. So in the 1830s, for example, there were a series of small famines around the country. While not as great an impact as the Great Famine 1845 to 49, they still would have caused people to have been displaced, dispossessed of their land holdings, and perhaps then forced to move elsewhere in search of work. It's very interesting to look at what sort of the economy in Ireland would have been like in that period as well. So there'd been a boom time in the late 18th and early 19th century. Farmers were doing very well because food prices were high during the Napoleonic Wars. But when the wars were over, prices dropped. People perhaps would have lost land holdings because they weren't able to make enough money to pay their rents, things like that, which would have caused them to move on. Industry then changed things for people as well. So people would have started moving perhaps to urban areas in search of more work. There were building booms in Dublin and cities like Cork as well. So that would have attracted a lot of people because there would have been a demand for tradespeople, bricklayers and masons, carpenters and so on. You also find that the building of the railways and the canals, as they spread out across the country, they would have moved people in that they would have provided means of transport for people, but also the people who were employed on the building works. So you have families that you find perhaps in places like Carlow who would have been employed on the railways or the canals, would have made their way up through Kildare towards Dublin, or maybe working from Kildare area out towards the west, things like that. So those are some of the reasons why you would find people moved around. Another place you could look would be the army. So people joined their county militias, for example. As those militias became regularised into the British Army, they were then posted to other counties. So you find soldiers who would have started out in one county, ended up in another. They may have met and married their wife, who was local to a different place, and when they'd finished their service, that may have been where they settled, not their county of origin. So there's lots of different reasons why people would have moved around.
So it's not automatic to assume that somebody in rural Ulster will automatically move to Belfast, or somebody in rural Leinster will automatically move to Dublin. They may move further afield to another city.
Exactly, depending on, employment opportunity is obviously going to be a big driving force for why people moved and where they moved to. But looking at a city like Cork, for example, Cork had access to the European markets much more so than a city like Dublin. So there was far more trade, there was far more activity coming into Cork. That may have attracted people from the province, but also from other parts of the country. I've come across stories where people from Ulster, who would have been in the linen industry, who had perhaps textile mills and things like that, who then wash up down in Cork. And it's hard to explain such a distance, but it's not unheard of to find people covering the entire country and stopping and settling somewhere else. And again, usually for some kind of economic reason.
Now, another issue we may look at is interfaith marriages, mixed marriages, and how prevalent that was in this period in the 19th century. What type of records would you be looking at if you wanted to check through marriages and see what the faiths were of the people involved?
Well, there's 2 points there. I suppose the first one is there's no hard and fast rules when it comes to the population. While one might assume most marriages would be within their faith, there's actually a surprising number. You do come across a surprising number of mixed marriages when you're researching. And I think people don't expect to see that and think of it perhaps as something that's a lot more of a bigger issue based on their perspectives from today than it was at the time. It wasn't happening all the time, but I think it was a little bit more common than people perhaps believed. Now, there is a difficulty in identifying mixed marriages. For civil registration, which was part of the second half of the 19th century, which started in 1864, the denomination of the bride and groom is not recorded on the marriage certificate. What's only identified is the church in which they got married. So you've no idea whether one party is of the other faith than the church in which they got married. Now, when you find couples who married in a registry office, there's a fairly good assumption that it was a mixed marriage. And so they haven't, say, settled in one church or the other. You sometimes find then a marriage that took place twice, one in a Roman Catholic church and then again in a Church of Ireland church, which again is a very good indicator that it was a mixed marriage. But otherwise there isn't usually an identification that that was the case. When you're looking at parish registers, you do sometimes then get a reference to the fact that the one party, the bride or the groom, is of the other faith. In terms of Roman Catholic records, what you sometimes find is that one of the individuals has been baptised into that church just before the marriage took place, which again would say to you that's where they've come from, or that the parish priest has identified that person as being of the other faith when the marriage took place. And similarly, that can happen in Church of Ireland records. So it's very difficult to get statistical information as to how many mixed marriages there were, and what you're looking for are clues in the religion that the children might have been brought up in. Sometimes when you find people on a census return, you'll see that the husband is one religion or one faith and the wife is another. Or if they're of the same faith, you might find that the mother-in-law or father-in-law or sister-in-law who's living with the family is of the other faith, and that suggests that she was originally Roman Catholic or Church of Ireland. And you also get families whose children are brought up in the two faiths, that all the boys would be baptised into the father's faith and all the girls into the mother's faith. So those will be the clues, but there isn't something that will always stand out and identify a mixed faith marriage. Even going by surnames, like you can generalise Asian, you can look at a surname and assume it to be of one faith, but that may have been the case in previous generations. The mixed marriage you're looking for may have actually taken place much earlier than you're assuming it did.
Now, if we're looking at cemetery records, as you mentioned there with mixed marriages, the boys might be raised at the father's religion and the girls would be raised with the mother's religion. When that came to burials and the family all went to be kept together, was that something that happened often?
Well, and the question comes from this family who were Roman Catholic, who were buried in the local Church of Ireland cemetery. The Church of Ireland was the established church, which means that it did take on some of the sort of civic responsibilities prior to sort of say things like civil registration. And one of those applied to burials. You do find Roman Catholics buried in a Church of Ireland graveyard, and in a sense that is the Church of Ireland taking on the civic responsibility for the burial of that individual in the absence of another authority who would take on that responsibility. So again, I don't think that there's any hard and fast rules about the location or the denomination of the person based on the graveyard that they're buried in. In some cases it may have just been a very practical solution. I've heard comments from people about the fees that would have had to have been paid when it came to burials and funerals and things like that. And again, it may have just been an economically practical solution to choose a particular denomination. And obviously a family connection to a denomination, even though they had moved into the other faith through a marriage.
And would it be true to say that regarding mixed marriages and the interaction between different faiths, that would be a bit more liberal perhaps in the 19th century than in the late 19th and early 20th century?
I think so. And I think the famine is a sort of a crucial point in that as well, is the attitude of the Catholic Church and the attitude of the Catholic population changed very much after the famine. So prior to that period, I think there may have been a liberal attitude towards mixed marriages. Families themselves may not have approved. And don't forget that the Church of England or the Church of Ireland at the time wasn't always such a benevolent force either. It was quite evangelical and would have disapproved of mixed marriages as much as the Roman Catholic Church would have. Sometimes you find it's down to local opinion rather than a sort of a national opinion. So again, it varies on family to family, it varies from place to place. A family may not have approved of a mixed marriage. In other instances, you find a family may have approved of a mixed marriage, but locally the population or the parish priest or the Church of Ireland minister may have vehemently disapproved of a mixed marriage. That's why you find sometimes couples of a mixed marriage who may have moved elsewhere, who've left the parish that they came from, or went away to marry before settling in their home parish to avoid, I suppose, the disapproval or any intervention in their marriage.
Now, getting back to that famine period, how difficult is it to trace the records from then? Are the records accurate in the famine and pre-famine period?
I suppose what it is that there's very little from that period. So pre-civil registration, so we don't have the state registering births, deaths and marriages, with the exception of non-Catholic marriages which were registered from 1845. And again, that's another clue. If you find a Catholic who marries and whose marriage appears in civil registration after 1845 and before 1864, they're marrying in a Church of Ireland or in a registry office. So it's more than likely a mixed marriage. So you're relying on parish registers for baptismal and marriage information, and not all parishes have registers that survive or were kept from that period. So you can have gaps. And again, the person who sent in the inquiry hasn't been able to identify earlier generations because the registers for the parish in Kildare where he found his family only start in, I think, 1849. Equally, the parish priest would have been overwhelmed with the level of death and immigration in his population. And I think you may find that record keeping was poorer during that period because of things like that. There's little in the way of comprehensive land records. So while we have something like Griffith's Valuation, which is a comprehensive survey of property in Ireland, that commenced in 1847, but really the records for that date from the 1850s. So it's just post-famine period. What we rely on for land records earlier than that are things like the tithe allotment books, which are not as comprehensive. They date from the 1820s and 1830s. They really only focus on agricultural land, so people in urban areas don't appear in those. And of course, we don't have census returns. Fragments survive from 1821, 31 and 41, but really for the entire country we don't have census returns. So it's very hard to locate somebody, particularly again if they're moving around, if they've gone from one place to the other. It's very hard to document that in the pre-famine period.
Well, it must be incredibly frustrating for the amateur genealogist and the professional genealogist if you hit a brick wall like that.
It is, and you've got to start perhaps thinking a little bit creatively, and that's where it comes down to, like, looking at surnames, looking at things in a more general sense. And once you've got a feel for where a surname might have originated or where it's concentrated in a particular area, and focusing on that area as a place of possible origin for your ancestor, and working on the process of elimination. So taking into account all possible places of origin, and if there are records that survive, seeing if you can eliminate each of the families that you've identified as being the family that your ancestor may have come from. And that requires, I think, very methodical and painstaking work to do. And I've had clients and I've met people who have done that, who've been forensic about it, taken every single possible family and slowly but surely ruled them out until what they are left with can only be the family that their ancestor originated from. This is where I think the change is happening with a lot of records being online, in that I think people don't necessarily appreciate when you go into a database and put in a name that you're searching for and it comes up with a negative result. It's looking at why is that a negative result. If you're looking for the baptism of somebody in sort of 1830, it's somewhere in Ireland. Are you aware that actually very few baptismal registers survive for that period? So the reason you're getting a negative result is probably because the records don't survive, and you've got to step back and take a look at another way of identifying where that person may have come from by looking at records later in their life. Is there a gravestone that says where they were born, or a newspaper obituary that says what county they came from? And then you can refocus your search on a particular county or a particular area for families with that name, and looking at those to see is there a possibility that your ancestor was connected to those families.
And out of interest, would there be any records available in Britain dealing with Ireland in this period that would be useful?
Very little, as far as I'm aware. One area that might be useful for people is to look at the owners of land in Ireland and what records they have created in terms of the administration of their estates, their lands. So did they keep rent rolls? Did they have tenant application books? Things like that, leases. And where are those records held? Now, a lot of those collections have been divided up, and the Irish records have been deposited in Irish repositories, but you still find in archives throughout the United Kingdom collections that pertain to Irish estates that include details of tenants, which may be useful for your research. And it takes you back to the land. So in the absence of birth, death and marriage records, such as parish registers, your focus then needs to be on land records. And part of that is looking at the landlord for a particular area and what records survive from the administration of a person's estate in Ireland.
So if we thought that our ancestor was the result of a mixed marriage or was from a Protestant faith further back, would we be more confident that the records would exist among the different Protestant denominations for him or her?
It's a good question, because while the Church of Ireland records would probably have dated back a lot earlier than the Roman Catholic records, unfortunately the majority of those were deposited in the Public Record Office, which was destroyed by fire in 1922. So in actual fact, a large portion of Church of Ireland records have been destroyed, which makes it very difficult to go back and identify people in Church of Ireland records. You do have Presbyterian records which survive. The majority of those obviously are going to be in the area of Ulster, and you can find them in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland or through the Presbyterian Historical Society. So even Presbyterian congregations that you might find in the Republic of Ireland, what is today the Republic of Ireland, you may find that they are now held by the Presbyterian Historical Society. So contacting them, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland has an excellent guide to church records on its website, and they identify surviving Methodist, Presbyterian, Church of Ireland, Roman Catholic and other denominations for each parish in Ulster, because they have sort of taken in some of the what would be the border counties today. So if you're looking at families in Cavan and Monaghan, you may find that those records are actually in Belfast. Certainly the Protestant records would be in Belfast, or copies of. Your detective work again is tracking down whether the parish that you're interested in has Church of Ireland, Presbyterian or Roman Catholic records. And if you're unsure about the denomination, if you're unsure about the possibility of a mixed marriage, unfortunately it means you're just going to have to search all of those records. And you equally find that there were Presbyterian families that utilised the Church of Ireland. And this has something to do with sort of, again, the Church of Ireland being the established church, that a marriage that took place in the Church of Ireland or a baptism in the Church of Ireland was given a little bit more legitimacy than one that happened in any of the other denominations. So you do have certainly have Presbyterian families who would use the Church of Ireland. So don't just focus your research on Presbyterian records. I would also look at Church of Ireland records for a parish as well.
And if we're looking at a name that's unusual, could it be that the name has acquired a different spelling over the years?
Exactly. You'll see names evolved, particularly unusual names, and the name of the inquirer, which I think is Lernan, is very, very unusual. So I had a look at Griffith's valuation, which is an excellent starting point if you want to identify where particular surnames appear. Because again, it's a nationwide survey, it's the most comprehensive records that we have from the 19th century that identifies nearly every household in the country. So it gives you a very good overview of where particular surnames occur. And looking at that, his family were in Kildare from, let's say, the 1850s, 1860s. But prior to that, it seems that the only place where that name appears is Antrim. And then there's a few of another variant, which is Larmont in Derry, and in very, very small numbers. And I had a look at a number of surname dictionaries, so surname dictionaries for Ireland, England and Scotland, and the name doesn't appear in any of them, in that it is in such small numbers it's not featuring. So that suggests the name may have even come from further afield. Particularly in the Ulster area, you see immigration from the Netherlands, so you have Dutch, you have Danish, you have Scandinavian people settling in what is today Northern Ireland, coming perhaps as merchants and setting up shop as early as the 15th century and before. So that could be one of the reasons or one of the origins for a particularly unusual surname. Now obviously you have a lot of Scottish surnames that were transferred to the Ulster area as well and to other parts of Ireland. And over time you see those names start to change through misspelling or different spellings. You also see things like the Mac and the O changing, being lost from surnames and then reintroduced at later times. So always be very careful. Don't be too married to the exact spelling of the surname as you have it in your records from, let's say, the 20th century or from late 19th century American records, because the spelling could have been imposed by somebody on arrival in that country, and in an earlier time it could have been slightly different. Like another example would be Walsh. I've had Americans who have Welsh, W-E-L-C-H, as their surname and adamant that that was the name, that was how it was spelled. Now it's very uncommon by that spelling in Ireland, but Walsh, W-A-L-S-H, I think there was about 10,000 Walsh families in Ireland in the 19th century. They were most likely Walsh. At some point that name may have just altered to Welsh purely by the spelling that a clerk used when a record was being created. And don't forget, the majority of the population in the early 19th century were illiterate, so they weren't using a specific spelling of their name either. It was the spelling that was created by the person who created the record.
Now, is there any resources you'd recommend for looking at surnames?
There's an excellent one which is created by John Grenham, which is hosted on the Irish Times website. So it's irishtimes.com/ancestor. And on that you'll see there's a surname search facility and a place name search facility. So I'll come to the place name one in a minute. But the surname search facility allows you to just put in a surname, and what he's done is used Griffith's valuation, which I was just talking about, to identify where a surname appears across the country. And so there's a visual representation of that, and there's a map which you can roll over and identify parishes within counties that a particular surname appears in. So quite quickly, by putting a surname into that and looking at the map, you can see where the name is concentrated. So again, you might see Ulster, you might see Cork and Tipperary, where a particular name is found in large numbers, and how it spreads further out from those areas. Other names that are very, very common you will just see across the entire country, and which can be very dispiriting when you're trying to identify where your ancestor might have come from. He also includes on that then definitions of surnames, so using sources like MacLysite, who would be one of the authorities on the origins of Irish surnames. You get a brief description of what the origin of the particular surname you're searching for is, as well as what the other variants of that surname are. And that becomes very important when you're doing your research, to just be aware of what the other variants are, so that when you're searching databases, some of which will give you answers or results based on an accurate surname, to try all the other variants which a search engine may not be aware of, if you like. So it's an excellent resource. If there are any more in-depth surname histories, there are links to those as well as crests for particular surnames as well. The Irish origin of the surname too, or the English or Welsh or Scottish origin of a surname can appear on that as well. So it's a really fascinating resource and gives you a great insight into sort of where the name possibly originated, what etymologically where it came from, as well as what parts of the country. And then on the same site you have this place name search, which again is another incredibly useful resource, because within that you can search for any townland name in Ireland. There's a database of townlands, but there's also then maps. So there's civil parish maps. Civil parishes correspond with Church of Ireland parishes. So again, if you're looking for Church of Ireland records, you need to identify your civil parishes so you know which parishes you're looking for. Alongside that, there are Roman Catholic parish maps. And Roman Catholic parishes differ from Church of Ireland or civil parishes. So it's important to be able to see what the Roman Catholic parish is for a particular area. You can click through on that. It'll tell you what parish records survive for that Roman Catholic parish, where those records are located, so where they are online, and also the microfilm reference numbers for them in the National Library of Ireland. And you can click through from there and it will give you a list of what civil parishes appear within that Roman Catholic parish. And as you narrow it down into each civil parish, there is then a list of townlands that appear within each civil parish. Using that can give you a really good sense of what, or sort of where your ancestors were, what the different denominations of land are, which is very important when you're tackling different sets of records. So civil registration is organised using registration districts, which are the same as unions. Catholic records are organised by Catholic parishes. Land records, for example, are organised by civil parish. So it's good to be able to just get a feel for what the denominations are in the area that you're interested in.
Well, thank you very much, Nicola. I hope that answers some of the questions from James and other listeners who submitted questions. As we've said, if anyone has any further questions or if there's any queries we can help you with, please contact the website. And if anyone would like to contact Nicola Morris, they can contact her through the website timeline.ie.
You can also visit our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter as well. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Nicola.
Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Timeline.ie podcast on Irish genealogy. Timeline is Ireland's leading professional genealogy and research company. During this series, we will be looking at different aspects of Irish history and giving you helpful hints in tracing your Irish ancestors. My name is Cathal Brennan, and in each episode I will be joined by professional genealogist Nicola Morris. On this episode, we will be looking at different archives in Dublin and how to access them. So Nicola, could you name some of the archives in Dublin that people would access if they wanted to look into their family history?
First of all, just to say that the records for the entire island of Ireland can be found in repositories and archives in Dublin City. And it often befuddles a lot of visitors because different records are in different archives. So there's quite a few places that you may need to visit if you're coming to Dublin City to do some research. Among those are the General Register Office, the Valuation Office, the National Archives of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland, the Registry of Deeds, and numerous other smaller repositories that are located around the city. So there's plenty of places to visit, and each one has maybe a unique set of records that might be valuable to your research.
Well, if we look first at the National Archives, what type of records are stored there?
Well, the National Archives is essentially the archives for the administration of the state. And so they hold things like, most importantly for genealogy, the census returns. So that's the 1901 and 1911 census, which are complete. Now, of course, those records are freely available online on the National Archives website. They also hold fragments of census returns that survive from the 19th century. Again, they've been digitised and are on their website. But what you also find there are things like prison registers, court records, wills and testamentary records, workhouse records, certainly those for Dublin City and County, land records, so some early deeds for the country, some estate papers or personal papers that have been deposited with the National Archives, solicitors' papers. So there's quite a lot of material that's held there, some of which is very valuable for genealogical research.
Now, can you just walk in off the street and request these records?
The National Archives is open to anybody, but in order to use the archives or even to visit the reading room, you do need to apply for a reader's ticket, which you can do on the day when you arrive. However, it's really important that you have the necessary documentation with you in order to apply for a reader's ticket, because I've seen people who've come from halfway around the world and have been refused entrance on the day because they don't have the right paperwork. So what you need are 2 forms of identification. One of these being photo ID, so a passport or a driver's license, and something else that's a proof of your address, so a utility bill. Now, if you just have those 2 documents with you, there shouldn't be a problem getting a reader's ticket, and then you're free to use the reading room. What the Archives also has is a free genealogy advisory service. Now, this is staffed by professional genealogists. It's open from 10 a.m. until 1:30 p.m. It's absolutely free. Now, it can get busy during the summer months particularly, so the earlier you get there, the better. And a genealogist there will be able to help you not just navigate the archives, but actually any repository that you need to find in Dublin City, what records you might need to find there, and help you get started or progress your family history.
And I should also ask you as well, where is the National Archives located?
Okay, the National Archives is on Bishop Street. It's actually on the site of the old Jacob's Biscuit Factory. It's just off Ainger Street. So where you find Ainger Street DIT, behind the DIT you'll find the National Archives of Ireland.
Now, next, can we look at the National Library and deal with some of the same questions?
First of all, it's a copyright library for Ireland, so they hold copies of published material, and mainly it is a repository for published material as opposed to the National Archives, which has a different remit. For genealogical purposes, what the National Library holds are, most importantly, microfilm copies of nearly all of the Roman Catholic parish registers for 18th and 19th century Ireland. So if you are researching a Roman Catholic family, the National Library is going to be one of your main destinations in order to access the parish registers there. This summer, hopefully, the National Library are going to have all of those parish registers digitised and made freely available online on their website, so you don't necessarily have to visit. But what you'll also find at the National Library is their newspaper collection. It's the largest collection of historic newspapers on the island, so they have a copy of nearly everything that was published. The only larger collection is actually with the British Library. So using the newspaper archives in the National Library can be very, very valuable, bearing in mind some have been digitised, but there's a large majority of papers that haven't been digitised yet, so you may need to access them there. They're mostly available on microfilm, and this is in order to conserve the original papers. So the National Library of Ireland is found on Kildare Street. It's part of the same complex that forms Leinster House and the National Museum of Ireland. It's absolutely free to enter. You are free to visit the library. You can go in and take a look at the reading room. You're not allowed to photograph the reading room, but you can certainly go in and have a look. There is a genealogy service also in the National Library on the mezzanine level, where they have computers with access to lots of different websites, so you can get free access to things like Ancestry.com, Find My Past, the Irish Newspaper Archive, and numerous other collections online. They have genealogists on duty, staff members who are very, very helpful and will help you navigate the records that they have in the library. They have a microfilm room where you can access all of the Catholic parish registers, which are in their own set of cabinets. And then on the reading room floor is where you will need a reader's ticket if you want to use any of the material that has to be called up. So similar to the National Archives, you do need some form of identification in order to apply for a reader's ticket. You can do it on the day when you arrive. It takes about 20 minutes. And once you've got your reader's ticket, you can use that to start ordering up copies of, say, microfilm newspapers, publications, and anything else that you know is in their collection that you might find useful. There is another part to the National Library, which again is very important for genealogy, and that is the manuscripts department. Now it's in a separate building on the same street, so it's further down the street beside the Alliance Francaise. In the manuscripts department, what you will find are a lot of collections of estate papers. If you're researching a family in a particular area and you've identified their landlord and discovered that there are estate papers for that landlord located in the National Library, they are most likely in the manuscripts department. So again, you'll need a reader's ticket to access those collections. You order those material up and it'll be ready for you when you arrive at the library. So if you want to order material that the library holds, you can do this online on their website. They have an online order form, so you can order the material in advance. You state what time you want it to be available for you when you are visiting the library. So it's usually about a 2-hour interval between each ordering time, so you can have stuff ready for 9:30, 10 a.m, midday, 2 o'clock and so on. And you don't need a reader's ticket number to place an order, but you will need your reader's ticket in order to access that material.
Now next, if we looked at the GRO, could you tell us about that, please?
The GRO is General Register Office. And so the General Register Office have a research room which is used by genealogists. And this is located on Werburgh Street. So it's just behind Dublin Castle, almost opposite the famous Burdock's fish and chip shop. The General Register Office is the location of the birth, marriage and death index books for the entire country, up until 1922, and for the Republic of Ireland after 1922. So if you have an ancestor who was born, married or died in Ireland after 1864, when those records commence, then your first stop is to go to the General Register Office and get copies of a birth certificate, marriage certificate or death certificate. You don't need a reader's ticket. Anybody can go into the General Register Office, but there are fees involved in accessing the records. So if you're visiting in person, and you want to manually search the index books, which is something that I'd always recommend doing, because the online indexes, while they're very, very helpful, can sometimes be missing entries. And you also find when you look at the index books that there are handwritten entries that are late registrations, say, or have been entered into the wrong part of the book and have been moved. So these handwritten entries don't necessarily appear in a lot of the online indexes. So a manual search of the books can be very, very useful. It costs €2 to search 5 consecutive years of books. So if you're looking for somebody who was born, say, in 1872, you want to search the books from 1870 to 1874 inclusive, that's going to cost you €2. You pay your €2 and then you take the books down off the shelves yourself. When you find an entry that you're interested in, you fill in a little slip and you pay €4 to see a copy of the birth registration, the marriage registration or the death registration, and it'll be produced for you in about 10, 15 minutes, 20 if they're very busy. So you can get a lot done in there. If you're planning to do a lot in the General Register Office, you can actually pay for a general search. So this is €20. You get the whole day and you get to take down and look through as many books as you want. Now, you can have 2 or even 3 people working from one general search. So if you bring a team with you and you get your family members involved as well, then you can all accomplish quite a lot in one day. Each person per day is entitled to request 8 copies of a birth, marriage or death registration. If there's more than that you need, the staff will either post them or email you copies of those entries out to you the day or 2 days following.
And do you have to be there in person, or can you order any of this stuff online?
You can actually order online with the Timeline Genealogy Clerk service. So if you found a registration for a birth, marriage or death in any of the online indexes like Family Search, Find My Past or Ancestry.com, and you want to see a copy of the registration, if you go to timeline.ie to our Genealogy Clerk service, very straightforward, just fill in the form. It's €19 for the copy of a birth, marriage or death registration, and they will be emailed to you within 5 working days of receiving your order.
Now, what type of information would you get on a birth, marriage or death certificate?
So marriage certificates are usually the most informative, and I would always recommend that you get copies of a marriage certificate because they'll record the name of the bride and groom, their age, occupation and address at the time that they're getting married, the names of their fathers and the occupation of their fathers, the name of the church that they married in, and the witnesses to the marriage. So that one document will give you 2 generations of a family, details of occupations, whether the father is deceased, places where the person was living. So there's a huge amount of information there. It is important to bear in mind that when you look at a marriage registration, the address given on the marriage certificate is only the address where the person spent the night before the marriage. So it's not necessarily a home address for that individual or a long-term address for that individual. Birth certificates will give you the name of the child, the mother, her maiden name, the father's occupation and the place of birth. Now, death certificates are actually the least informative. While they'll give you the name of the deceased person, their age, their marital status and their occupation, the cause of their death, and then the name of the person who registered the death. But if this person died in an institution, so in a hospital or a workhouse, the person who registered the death is often just going to be an administrator. So you don't tend to get the names of other family members on Irish death certificates, which can be very disappointing because in other countries you can get a lot more biographical information on death certificates.
And how do the fees compare in Ireland using these services to other countries?
Well, actually, being able to attend the GRO in person and purchase, they're simply photocopies from the register. They're not certified, they can't be used for passport applications or anything like that. But all you're interested in is in the information recorded on it. €4 is incredibly good value because compared to the UK, certainly where I think it's £9.25 sterling for a certified copy, but at the moment they don't give you the option of just getting a photocopy from the register. Now there is talk that that will be introduced in time. But equally in the United States, you're talking about, say, $20 for copies of certificates. So it's very good value, but unfortunately you need to be on the ground in Dublin to be able to access that.
Now, I think we'll move on to the valuation office. Could you tell us about that, please?
Okay, so if you're familiar with Griffith's valuation, which was a nationwide survey of property taken in the 1850s, the valuation office holds the continuation of Griffith's valuation. So these are essentially copybooks where the valuator has recorded the information originally found in Griffiths and then revisited the townland to update the records periodically. So you have books that run from the 1850s early 1860s right up to the 1970s for all residential property in the Republic of Ireland. These records are held at the valuation office. They're slowly being digitised, but there really isn't any sign that they're going to be available online anytime soon. So you do have to visit the valuation office to view these records, or the Timeline Genealogy Clerk Service also allows you to order copies, digital images of the valuation office books. So visiting the valuation office, much like the General Register office, it's absolutely free to anybody to visit the office, but there are fees involved in accessing the records. So each set of books that you call up, because what you have for a particular electoral division will be maybe 8 or even 10 of these copybooks bound together. So you may get several books for one particular address that you're looking at. So one set of books costs €3.80 to review. There are fees for photocopying, but actually the staff in the valuation office allow you to digitally photograph any of the records that you're looking at, and there's no cost for that. It's important to photocopy or photograph the records when you're looking at them, because they're quite complex in that every time the valuator returned to the townland and had to update his records, he did so in a coloured ink. And the coloured ink corresponded with the date or the year that change had been made. So you may be looking at a page where you have a name being crossed out in blue ink, which represents 1872, another name of the same plot of land being crossed out in green ink then in 1875, and a new name being added in 1880, all in different colours. So having a good quality copy of those records helps later on when you refer back to them and you need to work out what order things happened in. The staff are really good in all of these places, and they will be able to explain to you what the records are and how to search them and how to get the most out of them. But before you go, it is worth your while reading up on each of the repositories and the records that you want to use, so that you're not wasting time trying to figure out what exactly it is you're looking for.
And where is the valuation office, Nicola?
So the valuation office is located in the Irish Life Centre, which is on Abbey Street. If you're approaching it from the river, you will see a large fountain, a man with horses, and the entrance to the valuation office is on the right-hand side of that fountain.
People will be a bit apprehensive about approaching people in these archives with questions. Do you find them friendly to lay people coming in asking questions?
Absolutely. And the thing is that the National Archives and the National Library both have a genealogy service. So they have dedicated staff who are there to answer your questions. The General Register Office, it's what they do every day. So they'll be perfectly prepared to answer your questions about the specific records that they hold. So they're not going to be able to give you much insight necessarily into parish baptismal registers or land records, but they'll be able to tell you everything you need to know about births, death and marriage registers. And again, same with the General Register Office. So yeah, they're always very open to visitors and helping you get the most out of your time in those repositories.
Now, there's another archive that you mentioned beforehand, the Registry of Deeds. Could you tell us about that?
So the Registry of Deeds is, well, it's one of my favourite places. A secret perch above the city. So the Registry of Deeds is located on Henrietta Street, which is a very famous street to my mind. It's a beautiful example of the great excess of the late 18th century Dublin, with huge houses built for the very wealthiest people in the city, which over the course of 100 years became one of the most abhorrent slums in the city, with houses filled with over 100 people cramming the rooms. So you get to travel all the way up through Henrietta Street to view those houses. Pass through the archway at the top of the street and take a left, and you will come to the Registry of Deeds. The Registry of Deeds was established in about 1708, and it's a repository of memorials of deeds of transactions pertaining to land. So if your family owned any land or leased a significant portion of land, there's a good chance that they will have records that appear in the Registry of Deeds. Even if they were small farmers who leased 7, 8, 20 acres of land, they may still appear in the Registry of Deeds. They may have lodged their lease If they were tenants at will, year to year, didn't have a lease on their property, then there's probably not going to be any record of them in the Registry of Deeds. But what you also find in the Registry of Deeds is if a marriage settlement had been made between two families when a marriage was about to happen. So the details of the marriage settlement would be lodged in the Registry of Deeds. When the head of a family died, the details of their will may appear in the Registry of Deeds because that involved the transfer of land. You also have people who will have taken out mortgages on their property and transferred their property to other family members and so on. So a lot of that. It wasn't compulsory to lodge anything in the Registry of Deeds, but you still find an awful lot of that documentation there. So again, absolutely free to use. You do have to go in. The reception desk will direct you to the office where you get a card which will allow you to pass through various doorways in the building, which you have to sign in for. The genealogical material is all up on the top floor. So there's a lift, but you can always try the beautiful ancient stone steps as well. And the top floor, what you'll find are 3 different rooms. One of the rooms is referred to as the mezzanine. It's a room with a mezzanine in it, which is where you'll find the land index books on the top up on the mezzanine. The land index books are organised by county, and within each county by barony, and then by the name of the townland. So if you know the name of the townland that your family member had land or had an interest in, then it's very easy to go and search the index books for that particular townland, and you'll find a reference to a deed between 2 parties and a reference number for the deed. So make a note of the reference number. Again, these records start in about 1708 and run all the way through. Now, for practical purposes, we can really only access records up to about 1924, after which it's usually better to get a solicitor to start researching the records there for you. Once you get your reference number, you need to go to the vault room, which is where the transcription books are, and you find the book 2111 or 379. You take this giant ledger off the shelf, and within the book then you should also have a reference to the page and then a reference to the actual deed number. So it will make sense when you start looking through the material. Adjacent to the vault there is also the name indexes. So like the land indexes, these are indexes by names. The name index is usually organised by the name of the grantor. So this is going to be the name of the landlord rather than the tenant. So it's a little bit more difficult using the name index books, particularly if you're dealing with a common name. From about 1830, the name index books also start to cite the county or the parish or a more specific place name, as well as the other parties to the deed. So it gets a little bit easier after that. But the early ones, there's so little information in the name index, it can be very hard to know which is the right record, and you can go through 10s and 20s and 30s of them before finding something relevant. The actual deeds themselves, it's very heavy legal language, but weeding through it, you can find sometimes 3 or even 4 generations of a family being referred to, as in somebody with a deed in 1830 might refer to their father's deed of the same land made in 1790 and the grandfather's deed of the same land made in the 1760s. So you can, if you're lucky, extract a huge amount of genealogical information from these documents. And the view from that room where the name index books are held, you're perched right up over the city. So you're looking out across the city, almost opposite the National Archives, which is on the other side. And equally from those windows, you're looking out over the city. So it is a lovely little place to work.
Now, we might talk about some of the other archives in Dublin that people wouldn't immediately think of.
There's lots of little repositories that can be useful to your research. So there is the Dublin City Library and Archive. So if you have any family members who are from Dublin City, that's an excellent place to visit. They have very, very good local history collections. They have a full set of Tom's Dublin Directory on the open shelves. So it's very easy to just sit there and track somebody through those directories right up to the present day. They have quite an extensive newspaper collection. They have a lot of material on things like, I suppose, the theatres, the lockout, all the sort of establishments of the city that you might be interested in. They also have the minute books for Dublin Corporation, which can make for very interesting reading. They have copies of the indexes of births, deaths and marriages on microfilm. They have gravestone indexes, and very importantly, is available on their website, which is dublinheritage.ie, are the electoral rolls for Dublin City. And so the earliest of these are the started in 1908, I think, 1908, 1909, then there's one for 1915. So if you're looking to identify a family member during the Rising, for example, you could always check the electoral rolls to see where they were living in 1915. And then another set that begins, I think, in 1939 and runs right through to 1964. So there's a lot of material there. You need to apply for a reader's ticket when you arrive. Again, you'll need some form of identification to make your application. There's no fees for using it. And it's located on Pearse Street. It's also known, I mean, a lot of people will still refer to it as the Gilbert Library. So it's the Dublin City Library and Archive. Another place that I've been using recently is the Archive for the Royal College of Physicians, which is located on Kildare Street, right beside the National Library. Now, you do have to make an appointment, and a lot of these smaller archives, you need to make an appointment to access them. The Royal College of Physicians hold a lot of sort of medical directories and medical registers from the 19th century. So if you've got somebody who had a medical ancestor, looking for them in those collections, the directories and the registries, you can often glean a little bit of biographical information, such as where they might have been educated, papers that they published, where they were employed as doctors, and so on. And then they have a lot of other archival material, such as the Kirkpatrick collection, which is just a collection of biographical information on Irish doctors, gleaned from newspaper obituaries and other sources. So there's a lot of material there for medical ancestors. They're putting a lot of it online on their website, but if you have any queries, it's worth getting in touch with them and seeing if you can make an appointment to visit their archive. Another place would be the Irish Architectural Archive, which is located on Merrion Square in a beautiful building, free to enter. You need to sign up for a reader's ticket, but that doesn't involve very much at all. And the Architectural Archive holds a lot of material on the entire country. So they have boxes for each county, broken down into specific locations within each county, which contain photographs of buildings and old photographs as well. So it's a really beautiful collection. If you have family perhaps associated with a big house or an industrial building, anything like that, to see whether they have any material. And obviously they have a huge library of work on architecture and architects, as well as a database of architects. You can access on their website, but you can also access when you visit their library. So it's a national repository. Now, of course, they do have a lot of material for Dublin City, but it is a national repository and very interesting for a visit.
So I think people who have already filled out some of their family history may find that mentioning these other archives, there's more information that they weren't aware of, that they could pad it out even more.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. You start building your skeleton family tree. You've got everybody's birth, death and marriage. And then you want to find out about how they lived their lives. And so using things like the National Library, like the collections in the National Library, where you can access the journals of the historical and archaeological societies for each county, where you'll find really detailed articles about the history of local areas. And even within those articles, you can sometimes find references to your ancestors. In some of these journals, I've come across articles that were written by, say, a parish priest in the 1870s. He's accessing information, local history that has since been destroyed, and it refers to a family that had been there for 200 years previously. There's a lot of material like that. The Ordnance Survey name books, for example, are in the National Library of Ireland. And these are the books that were compiled in the 1830s with the engineers who travelled around the country, collecting information on the name of each townland in Ireland. I think it alludes to the Brian Friel play translations. But looking at the actual books themselves, you see how they sourced the information, what sources they used for the townland names, and the transition from the Gaelic into it being anglicised, and kind of the effort that was made to try and maintain or retain as much of the Gaelic name as possible. The comments made by the person who was visiting the townland, the person that they spoke to for this story, and the description of the townland. So it can paint a very interesting picture on a place that your ancestors might have come from. So there's a wealth of information in these different repositories that will start to help fill out your family tree a little bit.
And for all these archives that you've mentioned, what are the opening times like?
Okay, so the opening times vary a little bit from place to place, and it's good to be just aware of what you can access. The General Register Office opens at 9 a.m. The last orders for certificates is at 4 p.m. and they close at 4:30. The National Archives and the Valuation Office open at 9:15 and they close at 5. They're all open throughout lunch as well. The National Library of Ireland opens at 9:30, and Monday to Wednesday they are open until 7:45 in the evening. So if you're short of time and you have work you want to do in the National Library and other repositories to visit, you can always leave the National Library until last because you've got a longer evening in there. But on Thursday and Friday, they are only open until 4:45. But they are the only place that is open on a Saturday morning from 9:30 to 12:45. So again, if you have to, you can always get in there on a Saturday morning. The Registry of Deeds doesn't open till 10. And believe me, I've been up there at 9:15 and had to sit around for 45 minutes. So they're open at 10 until 5. And not forgetting the Representative Church Body Library, because it's located just outside of the city in Churchtown. The Representative Church Body Library is the repository for Church of Ireland parish registers. So for some families, they have a very, very valuable resource there. It's free to visit, it's free to utilise. There are fees if you want copies of any of the records that they hold, but you can go in and you can make notes. You are not allowed to photograph the records when you're there. And the same is true for nearly all of the other archives. You need to ask for permission before you photograph anything, with the exception of the Valuation Office. What Church of Ireland parish registers survived the 1922 fire in the Public Record Office are nearly all held in the Representative Church Body Library. The exception are those Church of Ireland records for Ulster, and that does include some of the counties like Cavan and Monaghan that are in Republic of Ireland, but their registers are held in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Some registers are still held locally, and there are a very small number that are held in the National Archives of Ireland, but largely the collection is in the RCBL. Staff are very, very helpful. They'll show you how to identify and locate the records that you want when you get there. There is a very, very good guide that they have recently published on their website, which lists all of the parishes for the entire country. That's Church of Ireland. So before you make the trip out to the Representative Church Body Library, it's very worth your while checking what records that they actually hold. So on their website, anglican.org, you'll find a link to the Representative Church Body Library, or RCBL, and they have a guide on there which is a full listing of all of the Church of Ireland parishes on the island and what records survive for each parish and where they're located. So before you head out to Churchtown, because it is about 20 minutes, half an hour on the bus to get out there, you need to make sure that they have the records that you need. So where you'll find it is it's beside what was Mount Carmel Hospital. The street is Braymore Park, Churchtown. And I think the number 14 bus from the city centre will take you out there. Just ask the driver, he'll let you know. Staff are very helpful. They'll help you to find the records that you're looking for. They do close for lunch. So they're one of the only places that still closes for lunch. So they close between about, it's either 12:30 or 1 o'clock and 2:15. So if you are planning a trip out there, don't arrive at 1. You'll be hanging around for an hour and 15 minutes before you'll be able to get back in.
I think we've covered a huge amount of information in this episode. Thank you very much, Nicola. And if anyone would like to contact Nicola Morris, they can contact her through the website timeline.ie.
And you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
So that was Nicola Morris from Timeline Ireland Limited. If you want to contact Nicola, you can contact her by email at research@timeline.ie. So you can check out this and previous episodes of the show on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. Now the links to the Patreon are in the show notes, and if you get a chance, please rate and review the show. It really does help us. So until the new year, myself and my co-host John Dorney would just like to wish you a very, very Merry Christmas. And thank you to everyone who listened in during the year.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.